Well, we begin today with the evidence of Jryna, do we?
That's correct, sir.
Jryna, please.
Please state your full name.
Jryna Batters.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Jryna, you're here to tell us about your own infection with hepatitis C and that of your late husband, Donald. You and Donald were married in 1982 and went up to the Isle of Skye for your honeymoon.
Yes. Well, we went to Mull first.
But you fell in love with the Isle of Skye?
Yes, until we kept going backwards and forwards, and then we got stuck.
And you had 2 sons.
Yes.
And on one of your backwards and forwards as you were up on the island in May 1985, camping. Donald had an accident at the campsite. Can you tell us what happened?
Well, we had camped behind a wall in a place called Greshenish, which is really gorgeous, and he'd taken he was doing a reconnoitre, and he went down to the shore, and that year, 85, was very wet. Every day it rained, which didn't put us off, but he then thought, he triangulated, he thought, well, if I just climb above the shoreline onto the, it was sort of a shelf of land, he would be back on the camp. Except the piece of land he chose to put his weight on came away, and he pushed himself, and his glasses went one way, and a piece of rock pulverised the base of his thumb.
He was bleeding an awful lot at that point.
Actually, he got his glasses, he grabbed his elbow, stopped the bleed, and walked back the way he came. And then I drove him to Poetry Hospital, who said we're not touching him, and then to Broadford, which was, Poetry was about 20 miles from where we were camping, and then Broadford was about 30-odd potholey miles, and the doctors there just took the gravel out of his thumb, kept him overnight, and then he went to Regmore to have an amputation.
And the thumb was amputated at that point?
Yes.
And then in early 1987, Donald had an operation to remove one of his toes and to connect it back to where the thumb had been. And there was a complication during that operation. He was given blood plasma. And that was the only transfusion that you were aware of that Donald required in either the original accident or in the reconstruction.
Yes, it was 11 and a half hours because of they needed to have some vein connection for the thumb in his arm, because he'd had a sort of radial artery flap, and because they couldn't find the vein through his foot, it took 11 and a half hours, and he was in shock, and because of that, they had to give him something. He actually was coming round, and he heard them say, we have to give him something, and that's what happened.
You've obtained, or your solicitors have obtained, Donald's medical records, and there's no record of him having received any transfusions at all. Mm-hmm. But Donald's recollection was very clear that he had been told that he'd received plasma during the surgery.
Yes.
Was Donald given any information before that about any risks involved in receiving the plasma?
No.
Then in 1989, you moved up to Inverness and lived between Inverness and the Isle of Skye.
Yes.
And once the house on Skye was built, the family effectively moved to the island permanently in 1990. Mm-hmm. Donald remained at home and homeschooled your children. And he did some odd jobs of computing and gardening and things like that. Mm-hmm. And you've described yourselves as a very close, tight-knit family.
Yes.
Is there anything else you want to tell us about family life at that point?
Well, we I would be away sometimes in Inverness with my work, and or on the island, and Donald would take the boys. We had double canoes, and they were off down on the loch, and I would come back and walk down the shore, which was about 10 minutes walk, and they'd be like sort of like kippers on the front deck, and he'd be just sat there and they'd be just rocked, and they had a beautiful, very gentle life. They went, windsurfing when they were old enough, and canoeing, and lots of walking, and it was a free, happy space. And he used to read stories. We lived in a caravan for about 8 years before the house was completely built, and we used to have Saturday night beat-ups, which was like throwing them around until they got tired, which wasn't damaging. lots of giggles, and then they fell asleep. And he did the voices on the books. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was a big one. And Lil, his mum, had these fur coats, and they used to dress up. We did all sorts of lovely things, and yes, it was lovely.
You were a regular blood donor.
Yes, when I was at school, yes, and I did get a 50 donation badge.
And part of the reason you were conscious of giving blood is because you have a rare blood type.
Yes.
But then on 19th of December 1994, you received a letter from the blood service.
Yes.
And what did that tell you?
That I had hepatitis C, and that I was not allowed to give any more blood.
You were invited to make an appointment, and you went to see a doctor in Inverness.
Uh-huh.
And what did he tell you about hepatitis C?
He didn't. He was just talking about the hepatic artery and the circulation, and not much else. And I was still sort of reeling from this sort of not knowing what hepatitis C was, and why I had it, and he was the haematologist at that time, and didn't seem to know much himself apart from the hepatic artery and varices. He did mention varices.
And although you'd worked in a hospital, you're not medically qualified.
No.
And so for you, discussion about the hepatic artery didn't mean an awful lot to you.
No.
You said that as you left, you were given a letter to read.
Yes.
And you only later read it and understood it more fully. We've got a copy of the leaflet, which you think is what you were given. Henry, it's 2997 008, please. And we can see that the first paragraph explains that at some point in the past you've been infected by the hepatitis C virus. There's an explanation in the second paragraph about the virus being transmitted by direct blood injection, so blood transfusion or other means of transmission. The risk of sexual transmission is noted there. It can be transmitted by sexual intercourse, although the infectivity by this route is low, and there's no evidence of risk of transmission associated with ordinary daily contact with your household. There's then advice not to share razors or toothbrushes, and to use a condom, and you're then told you can't be a donor anymore. Were you told anything at that point about treatment options?
No.
Or possible future issues with your liver?
No.
In early 1995, your local doctor asked you and Donald to go and see him, and he tested Donald for hepatitis C. And Donald's test came back positive. At that point in time, did Donald know how he'd been infected?
No.
Donald assumed that you'd passed the virus on to him at that point. You've said in your statement.
Oh, probably, yes.
But at the bottom of the letter from your local doctor, there's a handwritten note asking Donald if he'd received any blood transfusions. But there was no clarity at that point that that was what had happened.
No.
You and Donald then went across to Regmore Hospital in February 95 to have liver biopsies. Can you tell us what happened after those biopsies?
We were in a sort of a ward, and there were beds and curtains, and he was in one bed and I was in the other, and the consultant, Zentler Monroe, interrogated us really and asked us about who we'd had relationships with and had we taken drugs, and checked. I remember he was looking at our arms for any tattoos, and it made me feel as though I was the guilty party having this infection.
You've described his manner as condescending with an autocratic style.
Yes, very autocratic. Well, you know, consultant gastroenterologist having to deal with an unknown entity and two people.
And
It was rude. He was very rude.
And you were questioned really very intensely about your sexual histories. But Donald did say he'd received a transfusion at that point.
Yes, he mentioned to the Zentler that you know, he was looking at his thumb, the transplant, and the discussion of the operation, and Donald said he was given plasma because he had been in shock because of the 11.5 hours, and Dr. Monroe basically said plasma's not a blood product and dismissed us.
Can you tell us a little bit about the effect of that conversation on you both and how you then viewed your infections?
It's a 3-hour drive back from, well, it was longer than that, 3.5 with the ferry, and we didn't really talk much. And it was like the sword of Damocles. I mean, it's bad enough being told you got something that is potentially going to hurt your life, but not actually knowing how, what, where, when, and then being treated like we were pariahs, and we were just in a limbo. And we had 2 little boys.
Partly because of that, you didn't feel able to tell anyone you
Yes.
had hepatitis C because you thought everyone else would make assumptions as well.
Yes. Well, what could we explain? We didn't know it ourselves. What can you explain when you're thrown into this situation where you know you've got an illness, you've got a something, and you know there's nothing, no support, no information beyond you've got something and we don't want you to do bloods and this and whatever.
Your understanding now is that you contracted the hepatitis C from Donald by sexual transmission, and you think that you had an increased chance of that route of transmission because of a particular problem you have.
Yes, it was. I think I had sort of cysts that needed to be cauterised, and I had them done in Regmore a few years before we were diagnosed, yes.
And so you'd suffered a number of years of quite severe internal bleeding from those cysts, and that's how you think there may well have been an increased risk of sexual transmission. At the end of the February, your local doctor asked you to see you both and told you that treatment was available for hepatitis C. And at some point in the autumn, you're not entirely sure, you think that Donald was given an article by your local doctor about hepatitis C to give him a bit more information about the condition and about the treatment.
Yes, yeah.
And you think he was given that in the context of discussions about the chances of the treatment working.
Yes. Yeah.
We're just going to have a look at that article because you've been able to provide it to us. It's document 2997007, please, Henry. And we're actually going to start on the last page of it. Thank you. We can see at the bottom right-hand corner the date, the 1st of September 1995, and it's from a journal called Update. And then if we look at the last paragraph of the conclusion, it says, all those, just the very end of it, all those found to be infected require referral for specialist advice about medical management. The general practitioner has an important role in the initial counselling of patients found to be anti-HCV carriers and in the administration of interferon therapy to those likely to benefit from treatment. And from that, the understanding is that this appears to be a journal that was produced for general practitioners.
But Donald was very good at, asking clear questions, and, and the GP said, well, this could be of interest.
And then if we go back to the beginning of the article, we can see what the article was telling GPs. It starts as this: hepatitis C has generated much anxiety, but in fact affects few people outside risk groups. Few carriers will develop severe liver disease. The authors review the natural history and significance of this virus. And then it goes on. Hepatitis C has become a major media-promoted issue with the focus on haemophiliacs and whether or not the introduction of hepatitis C virus testing in blood donors was delayed unnecessarily. At the same time, the licensing of interferon for hepatitis treatment has become an important issue medically. Yet this virus has only been detectable for the past 5 years, and it cannot be grown in culture. It's not surprising that there is much confusion about its diagnosis, natural history and significance. On the one hand, it's portrayed as a killer on the loose, yet on the other hand, its effects on the liver often progress only very slowly, and infection is asymptomatic in most patients. Indeed, most patients with chronic infection may never be detected. And if we go over the page under the heading Transmission of HCV, it says very few chronic HCV carriers in the UK give a previous history of acute hepatitis or have any symptom or sign of chronic liver disease. There are several high-risk groups, and it refers to the box and gives the statistics, groups at high risk of infection. Haemophiliacs, 80% infected. Then at the bottom of the box, multiple transfusion recipients, 0.2% infected. And alongside the box, in the text, it says blood transfusion recipients make up only 10 to 15% of chronic carriers in the UK. There's a note further down about the relative rarity of sexual transmission. And then it picks up the question of counselling. The most important part of an initial consultation, whether in the general practitioner's surgery or in a hospital clinic, is to address the anxiety of the patient. Many patients are convinced that they're infected with a virus which will cause rapid death and that they will have disseminated the infection throughout their family, who will soon be in a similar hapless state. In fact, it's estimated that fewer than 10% of chronic HCV carriers will eventually die of this illness, and the natural history of the infection, even in those patients, is often 20 to 40 years from the time of acquisition to the development of serious consequences of chronic liver disease. And then if we go back to the last page, the rest of the article is about interferon and explaining to the GPs how that works. And in the final page, there is a box dealing with the major side effects of interferon, and they are set out influenza-like symptoms following early injections, fatigue, lethargy, loss of libido, depression, alopecia, bone marrow suppression, abnormalities of thyroid function, and induction of autoimmunity.
Could we just go back to the previous page?
Of course. That's the page 2 of the document, Henry.
And the right-hand highlighted box. The last sentence it suggests that normal household contact can allow transmission.
It does.
That's rather different from the information letter, which we saw at 008. Can we go back to that?
It's 008. Yes. The GP article indicates it's very unlikely, whereas the information leaflet says
It
there
says
is
there is
no
no evidence of risk of transmission.
Indeed.
And then goes on to say don't share razors or toothbrushes, which itself just raises questions.
Absolutely.
Did you know where you were after all this information?
Donald was the one that protected me from confusion. I did read it, and it didn't actually give me any insights. And I actually then just denied. I just thought that that's total rubbish, and felt unsupported and confused, and scared and sad and angry and all those things. And you can't actually process all those feelings. When you start, you have to live and cook and clean and play and look after your children.
You and Donald both started treatment in October 1995. Was there any discussion with you both about the wisdom of both of you starting the treatment at the same time with 2 small children?
No. I think the GP just said the Regmore consultant has prescribed interferon and you inject it, which actually put me straight off, even before I even started. We were given a big yellow box to put the needles in the house, so that reminded us we had strange things, and had to pick them up at the chemist. So the chemist knew we were taking interferon, so that was like, people knew to some degree. Yes. No further information.
What was the effect of the treatment on Donald?
Well, not much. I don't know. I mean, he didn't say anything about the treatment. He just took it, and I was working, so I would have to take. I was staying over in Inverness a couple of nights, so I would take the interferon when I could, either in my accommodation or halfway through the day. I think I had to do something like 3 injections a week or something.
And can you tell us a little of the effect of the treatment on you?
I became very stressed and paranoid. I had an awful lot of, not an awful lot, but the other paramedics that I worked with started to see that I was not functioning properly. And there was this, when somebody isn't functioning, they make mistakes and they become bizarre. And so there were lots of emails and letters, just about emails then, yeah, basically saying that I wasn't a reliable practitioner at the time. And so that built up to me feeling very strange.
So physically you've described being exhausted.
Yes, I was also, yes.
But unable to sleep.
Oh, totally. In fact, that was really a strange time, yes. I could, when your brain is in stress, it's just like 100%. You're just not dreaming, you're just talking all the time in your head. This sort of pressure to constantly be processing things that, you can't do anything about, and, like people in stress, you start to see everybody as enemies, and, I don't do that. So, you're sort of having a fight in your head about, wanting to damage somebody. And when all that violence that I, as well as being exhausted, as well as not sleeping, it just was scary.
You've described that you felt you became psychotic.
Very.
Can you tell us about the two particular occasions that you've discussed in your statement? The first one of driving your car through Portree. Yes,
well, I was just approaching Portree, and there's a river, and it was a lovely day, and I just this thought came into my head that you could just drive off and go to sleep, and it was like something I would never even think of. This piece of suicidal thought telling me to go and sleep and rest.
You managed to drive home.
Yes.
And broke down.
And poor Donald, he was in tears because he didn't see me breaking down because I was so shielded. I was so made way, Jryna. And I needed to be strong and have a shield, and it broke.
It's okay. Take your time.
Yes, and then he realised I was very ill, and I just basically was in the house and went to bed, and I wasn't able to sleep properly, and he just would be there 24/7, and he explained that I wasn't well to the boys, and they were good, and we had a dog that looked after me, and I didn't have to be sectioned. Although at one stage, the other incident was where I had this compulsion to go and sit in the car because somebody was going to take some wheel nuts off one of the tyres, and that tyre would fall off the car. So I went out with my sleeping bag or my nightie and an axe, just in case that person was really going to be quite bad. And then I realised it was a bit cold, and they were in the kitchen. And I came back, because they said where I was going when I went out with the sleeping bag and the axe. They said, where are you going? And they looked at me and I said, I'm just going out to the car. And then came back in and they also said, is everything okay? And I said, yeah. So, but then the other bit, after that, I had that idea that, again, I think this is sort of like at the time in the 90s, there was all this thing about photographs of kids, in baths and taking kids away because you were doing pornographic stuff and that. So I spent a lot of time pulling out all our photograph albums and taking all the pictures out that had them playing without any clothes on. And that was a rattle person most nights doing something. And they just put up with me. And that was the whole of November, and I basically thought with the snow and things that I'd missed Christmas, but it actually hadn't. But, time was irrelevant, and yes. And we were so close that, when I was having my nightmares, and I screamed in my head for Donald, and he woke up. I didn't vocalise. He knew I was in stress. That's so close.
You could no longer go to work.
No.
And in fact, you'd also stopped the treatment after a month.
Yeah, well, as soon as I stopped, I realised that was how it had affected me, yes.
But the impact on your mental health continued despite having come off the treatment.
Yes.
Before we talk about work, your behaviour had obviously become very erratic. And you said in your statement that must have frightened the boys.
Yes.
Were you offered any form of counselling or psychological input at that time?
Not for interferon. I did actually see a counsellor for talking about my work. And anyway, I don't think anybody knew what to counsel for epilepsy, so what was the point of talking about hepatitis C when I didn't know what it was. And I didn't want to talk about it anyway.
You said in your statement that the interferon cost you your job.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Well, I was visiting the occupational health, and I was actually going back to the hospital and
Where you worked?
where I worked, and there wasn't that much sympathy with the, I was a head of a service, and the other service managers, had been the ones that had orchestrated an awful lot of, this person isn't right, and personnel were on their side, and I was advised to not be able to go back to work.
You ended up taking early retirement.
Yeah, I was recommended early retirement.
In 1996. But since getting your medical records, you found a letter from your GP to your work.
Mm-hmm.
Could we have a look at that, please? It's 2997-009. We can see it's from February 1997. First of all, were you aware that your GP had been asked to provide any form of letter?
No.
And until you got your records, had you ever seen this letter before?
No, it's a surprise. I mean, if I had seen that letter with all that information about hepatitis C, the interferon treatment, and the potential for it being a chronic, possibly killer, I think I would have been more aware of trying to get some better treatment.
Well, let's look through the letter step by step. It talks first about you having been found to have hepatitis C when you donated blood. And in the last section of the first paragraph, it records that Dr. Zentler Monroe had advised you start interferon treatment, which you'd done in October 95. About 1 month after starting treatment, she appeared to have a reaction to the treatment such that she was unable to cope with her work. Mm-hmm. It's not unusual for patients undergoing interferon therapy to suffer from profound changes of mood. She stopped interferon on the 18th of November 95 and gradually began to recover. Had you been given any information about the fact that it was the interferon that had caused the profound changes of mood?
No, but when I actually came out of the effects of the interferon, I did read. I mean, I had read the information paper in the, but you know how long it is, and everything is thrown in, and then I saw the psychiatric problems could occur.
And then if we look at the last paragraph of the letter, needless to say, the hepatitis C remains in her system, and it's quite impossible to predict whether her chronic hepatitis will progress to the stage of hepatitis.
That must mean cirrhosis.
It must mean cirrhosis, sir, yes. In the longer term, hepatic carcinoma is a known risk. At present, her liver disease does not produce any symptoms. She does, of course, still suffer from the stress related to the knowledge that she has a potentially fatal condition, which is transmissible to others, and for which there is no guaranteed cure at present. I think it's most unlikely that she'll ever be able to cope with the additional stress of a job which was mostly based in Inverness and which involved considerable amounts of travelling and staying away from home. Here, as you say, the GP set out the long-term risks of hepatic carcinoma. Mm. Were you aware of those at that stage?
No.
From the time you stopped treatment until 2018, were you provided with any follow-up or monitoring?
No, not on the hepatitis C.
Were you offered any further treatment between 1995 and 2018?
No.
And was Donald?
No.
Donald had gout between 2000 and 2012 and had some liver function tests. They were raised, and his records suggest that this was said to be because of alcohol consumption. Was Donald told anything about that?
No. If he had, he'd have been really insulted.
Donald's brother sitting next to you and has just laughed when we discussed alcohol consumption, but did Donald drink?
No. only like Christmas and New Year, possibly, but no, he was into. Well, I have a sort of a band called Vibes Up, and he used all sorts of other alternative therapies and things, and he treated his water with various different things. He wouldn't drink water from the tap, and he would eat seaweed on the shore, which was always very good, you know, all the bits of brown seaweed and green, and he always had, you know, we went on various clean diets with kale and no. And he stopped meat, really. He didn't hardly eat much meat. He didn't like it. Fish. But even fish, you know, he was very much one that went out and foraged and came back and would have... He was a banana on toast person with blackcurrant jam. That was his main staple. But apart from that, and porridge. But no, the drink was... I used to make Dan's and gin, but I mean, he never touched that apart from the fruit at the end of the thing. But
We did.
I know, you did, yeah.
At that time, 2000 to 2012, when there was this question of whether Donald had gout, was there any follow-up at that point in relation to Donald's liver?
None. Unless they talked to him about it, but I don't think so, I don't know.
You attended Regmore Hospital on a couple of occasions with broken wrists, and you had to have surgery to repair the fracture and were put at the end of the list because of the hepatitis C. At that point, was it picked up with you that you had had no monitoring? Was there any discussion at all about your hepatitis C?
None. In fact, the second wrist that I broke, that I had a plate in 2012, I picked up a sense that I was a nuisance on the ward, that, you know, it was an accident. I'd slipped and hit a rock, and I felt that the nurse on the ward saw me as an inconvenience.
Do you have any understanding now as to why there may have been no follow-up over that time?
Well, the liver nurse that subsequently, when Donald became ill and I was picked up then, this year in fact, and she said that she had only been in place in her job in Regmore from 2002, 2003 for the whole of the Highlands and the Outer Isles, and that Zentler Munro had been fighting to get funding for specialist liver nurses, and that was it really, that was funding qualified people, and she hit the ground with a massive brief.
Because one specialist nurse was covering the whole of the Highlands, all the Outer Isles.
Orkney, everywhere.
Throughout all of this time, you and Donald told no one about the hepatitis C.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us why that was?
I think that initial biopsy and the feeling like pariahs, and we had children, and the interferon, and I think it just, you know, there was a block. Put my head in the sand, you know, I just did not want to know, did not want to be seen to be a broken person.
Donald was very close to his brother, who sits with you today, but he didn't feel able to tell him either.
Mm.
And so absolutely nobody knew. Donald had no faith in doctors and refused to go and see them.
Yes.
But he then became unwell in about June 2018.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us what happened?
Well, he was doing heavy gardening, lifting big Jewson's blue bags full of grass and sticks. And he also went off and collected wood and things. And he thought he'd pulled a muscle, and he had diarrhoea for a fortnight. And then he because of that and not eating and everything he drank or ate just shot away. He then got a chest infection and then sinusitis. And then the ascites came and his legs swelled up. And we went on the 21st of December, my son and myself, my eldest son was at home. The GP had organised an ambulant emergency care clinic consultation in Regmore. So we went 6 o'clock in the morning and drove for the 9 o'clock opening of the clinic, where he had a battery of CT scans and bloods, and they couldn't do an MRI because that was a busy machine that day on the Friday. And at the end of the day, when Louis and myself came back at like 2 o'clock, they said, well, there are lesions in his liver, and we'd like to keep him in over the weekend, and then we can send him home on Monday. You can have him for Christmas. And there's a horrible discussion, and basically, the attending doctor was very adamant that he should stay and they'll look after him and reduce the edema. And Donald did not want to stay there, and Louis, my eldest son, also has more mental awareness of Donald's needs, and he said, we're going home, and we did. And if we'd have left Donald in the hospital, I think he would have just packed up his bags and died then, because he wanted to be home.
You then went back to see the doctor
The following week.
the following week.
With the results.
And what were you told?
Donald was quite aware that he was very ill and he wasn't eating properly. And he, like a Heath Robinson thing, he was using pallets for beds in the front room and put his legs up to drain them, and he would not, there was no interference to be had with anybody. Couldn't even get the district nurses. I was trying to persuade him to get district nurses. The doctor, he just said, tell me the full story. So she read out all the processes that they'd done and what was involved and how much damage there was. And he said, and what's your prognosis? And she said, well, there isn't any, it's palliative care. And he said, well, how long have I got? And she said, 3 months to a year.
But it could be any
It could be any time, yes. Yes, because there was a discussion on the phone as well to one of the GPs when he was home about potential, because of the swelling of his stomach, they were concerned that there was blood leaking from the damaged varices, which they were more aware of than anything else, and that there could be an instant blood loss or whatever, which actually happened.
March 2019, while he was at home, Donald collapsed.
Yeah, Louis was just taking him to the back. He was walking backwards and forwards. We had him in. We'd done an intervention. Richard had come up in January, and we managed to get a Ripple bed and district nurses. Well, it was 5 of us to 1, and yes, and he was, Louis was the one. I was in the kitchen, and he was holding on to Donald, and he just collapsed at the door and vomited a bucket load of blood, and we couldn't pick him up, so I phoned up the ambulance, and the ambulance came, and they gave him just a drip, and we went to Broadford for an overnight stay, and he was on drips to just bring back his water levels and balance everything. And They were lovely. I mean, you know, they looked after us all night. I was in a chair next to him, and the family came up the next day, and he was bright and breezy.
Went back home.
Went back home.
There were some other occasions of bleeding varices, but Donald had palliative care predominantly at home.
Yes.
And you've said that the district nurses were absolutely excellent in their care.
You know, they'd left all their home and mobile numbers. That was 5 or 6 of them. So, and only once we ever used, because he was such a gentleman. He would not want anybody to be out of, you know, to be taking them out of the inconvenience, yeah.
But sadly, Donald died on the 8th of July 2019. Can you tell us something of the impact of Donald's death? I know it's very fresh on you and your children.
No, it's it was a Sunday evening, and it was like he'd gotten to the stage on the Thursday before he died, that he could not actively do the things that we do every day. We don't, you know, in private in the toilet, and needed to have enemas and district nurses. And that was the first time he phoned. That was the Thursday we phoned. And then the Sunday he had to have another. And he felt that he'd lost his dignity and his self-reliance. And he knew. I didn't. I kept trying to feed him. When you see somebody just fading away. And then he stopped, he couldn't breathe, you know, gasping for breath. And Louis he'd done a meditation, he did lots of meditation. He was very much into, you know, calming and self-help. And he'd had lots of connections across the world with all these people, you know, it's energetics, it's to do with spiritual and emotional strength, which he was. And I miss that, dear. So he had the meditation and I went with him, dear. And I held him. And Louis was there, we both held him. And you know, when somebody is dying, and it was at home, thank God. And he just was gasping, and big gaps in between, like, you know, you're holding your breath. And we did that with him. And then he stopped. And then we just waited and waited to see if there was another breath. And then he died.
And you've said in your statement you've lost the love of your life.
Yes.
Our plans to grow old together in the home we both loved and that Donald built seemed cruelly taken away. And that the boys, although they're adults, are both utterly devastated.
My eldest son has been very good. He stays at home with me, but has not grieved. Even in the cremation, he sat away from the front. You know, he hasn't processed it yet.
In the midst of Donald's final illness, you were advised to start treatment for your own hepatitis C.
Yes.
And you did. Can you tell us about how you coped with your treatment?
Well, you know, I was caring for Donald. Between Louis and myself, we were looking after him, and we had a great timetable, a great sharing. I mean, such a support from him and the district nurses. And but I felt so guilty that he wasn't able to have this. It was too late. And I felt like as though I was disloyal to a relationship.
But you've also said in your statement, watching him deteriorate made you decide that you would try.
Well, he told me to. I mean, you know, I needed his his support even then, and he knew that. So strong. And even, you know, he hardly took any morphine. As Richard was saying, he was on the pump, and then he came off the pump and just had oral morphine and tablets twice a day. Because he was conscious, he did not want to go into any sort of fugue mind, non-thinking state. He wanted to be himself, and he wanted me to live.
He encouraged you to take the treatment. You took it, and you've recently discovered it. You have cleared the virus now.
Although I do have damage to the liver from the years of not being treated. 11% of my liver is not functioning properly.
Once you realised there was nothing more that could be done for Donald, you decided to seek legal advice, and you were then, through that contact, given information about the Scottish Infected Blood Service, and you've received payments from them, but you feel very strongly that it was too little, too late. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, Donald got a one-off payment, I got a one-off payment, and then he got a monthly income, and I did. But he only survived for one monthly pay. And now I have the widows, but, you know, that's not really saving his life. It's you know, money just does not bring back the person that you want to spend the rest of your life with.
And you'd retired early, and your finances had been very limited.
Absolutely, yes.
And throughout that time, you'd not been aware of the financial assistance schemes.
Well, again, we would probably not have chased it up. So, you know, we're terribly proud people, I suppose. And I got jobs working as a supported employment, and latterly now working as a volunteer support manager for a garden project in Skye. And so we've always coped, although we've always had to be careful. And Donald really hardly ever spent money. Everything was sort of, you know, we were sort of like, you know, we'd just take things that people were throwing away and recycle them. We were quite good at recycling things. And he just collected wood and built things around with bits that were given. And he actually had we did buy one of those Laugersill metal benches to chop our own, which he did. He cut logs of trees and built a shed at the back of the house with solar panels eventually put up. So he was very much into self-reliance, very much into using his abilities and his mind. And he always had really unusual ways of solving things and tripping me up. I could never, guess what he was going to do next, which was part of the relationship. Always surprising and lovely.
Jryna, those are the questions I have for you. I'm just going to turn and ask if there's anything from behind him.
What's this?
Mr. Dawson just asked me to raise a couple of matters with you. When you had the liver biopsies in 1995, were you told anything about the extent of liver disease that you both had at that time?
No.
And you stopped the interferon treatment after a month, the first one. Donald also stopped treatment at that time, and in his records it suggests that it was because he couldn't tolerate it. Why did he stop the interferon at that point?
Well, it was me. I had fallen apart, and we had 2 little boys, and I suppose I don't know whether it affected him, because he would not say if it had, but it was solidarity. He stopped because I couldn't take it, and the risk was too much. We couldn't care for the boys if both of us were behaving like lunatics, and I wasn't very stable at that time.
And finally, there was one other opportunity that Mr. Dawson wanted me to raise with you, that you could have been followed up in the hospital. I don't want to discuss why you were in the hospital, but you were in visiting someone in 1998, 1999, and you saw Dr. Zentler Monroe.
Yes.
And what happened?
Well, we were in the corridor visiting our relative, and he recognised us. I was in the lift with him, and we were stood at the end of the corridor looking out of a window, and there was an acknowledgement that he was aware we were there, and then he went one way and we stood at the window waiting to visit our ailing person. And that was nothing.
Jryna, is there anything else you would like to say?
Enough. Well, there's just the statement a little bit. Is that? Should I just read this? Yeah. Okay, so since late last year, I've experienced many firsts. I became a carer, and I really was infected with hepatitis C. Hearing these words from Donald, do not resuscitate. Praying for more days, hours and minutes to keep Donald alive. And holding my breath as he gasped, his last at 5 a.m. on the 8th of July 2019. I held Donald gently to wash and dress him so that he looked asleep. I heard my son calling family and all the people that needed to know, and then being called a widow. This inquiry is a first, and the evidence from our experiences should show the loss of health, life, happiness and dignity, and we all deserve better. And I'd just like to thank Sir Brian Langstaff for this inquiry, and yourself, Sarah, and Jamie and Lynn, and the people that have brought this here. It's been very painful, but cathartic. Thank you.
Well, you're entitled to our admiration. In particular, describing the devastating effects on you, your mental health, your physical health, explaining your feelings of guilt, however unreasonable they may have been to have, but you've told us those details, and to describe Donald's last days, particularly when it's a sad reflection for all of us, I think, that the day he died was as recently as the first day of the last week that this inquiry was sitting in Edinburgh.
Really?
So it's as recent as that, within the last 4 months. And although you've had your moments, you've been remarkably composed. I wouldn't have blamed you if you had simply broken down altogether. But thank you very much. Well, we'll take a slightly longer coffee break than usual, and we'll start again at 20 to 12. Thank you. 20 to 12.